The widening wealth gap in the United States, where the extremely wealthy control a substantial share of national wealth while a large portion of the population struggles to make ends meet, has been a driving force behind the rise of populist movements. This income inequality has fueled social and political tensions, setting the stage for populist leaders who promise to address the grievances of the working and middle classes. Academic research and historical examples provide valuable insights into how such unaddressed economic challenges can lead to long-term social instability and eventually to populist movements that reshape the political landscape. The extent of wealth inequality in the United States. In recent decades, the wealth gap in the US has grown significantly, with the wealthiest 1% now controlling nearly 40% of the country's total wealth, while the bottom 50% holds only about 1.5%. According to a study by the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, CEO compensation has increased by 940% since 1978, whereas the average worker's wages grew only by 12% during the same period. This disparity has created a deep sense of economic insecurity among American workers, particularly as wages stagnate and the cost of living continues to rise. The Federal Reserve's survey of consumer finances in 2019 showed that nearly 40% of Americans would struggle to cover an unexpected $400 expense, highlighting the financial vulnerability faced by a large portion of society. Wealth inequality and populism. Academic studies emphasize the connection between wealth inequality and the rise of populism, suggesting that when people feel left behind by the economic system, they are more likely to support populist candidates who promise radical change. Research by Thomas Piketty, a renowned economist, demonstrates that high levels of inequality reduce social mobility and erode trust in democratic institutions. In his book Capital in the 21st Century, Piketty argues that when wealth becomes concentrated in the hands of a few, democracy suffers as the wealthy exercise disproportionate influence over political decisions, leaving the majority feeling disempowered and marginalized. Political scientist Larry Bartels echoes this view in his research, showing that the American political system has become increasingly responsive to the interests of the wealthy, often at the expense of the working and middle classes. His studies suggest that as inequality rises, so does the risk of social unrest and populist backlash, as people become frustrated with a political system that seems to serve the wealthy more than the general populace. These findings indicate that unaddressed economic inequality is not just an economic issue, but also a threat to democratic stability. Inequality leading to populist movements. The impact of economic inequality on political stability is not a new phenomenon. History shows that when wealth disparities are left unaddressed, they can lead to social unrest and the rise of populist movements. One prominent example is the Gilded Age in the late 19th century United States, when rapid industrialization created vast wealth for a few while leaving many workers in poverty. This era saw the emergence of populist movements, such as the Populist Party, which rallied around the interests of farmers and workers who felt exploited by big businesses and monopolies. The Populist Party advocated for policies like bimetallism, government control of railroads, and progressive taxation to counterbalance the power of the wealthy elite. Another historical example is the Great Depression of the 1930s, which resulted in massive unemployment and poverty, while a small segment of society maintained their wealth. This economic hardship led to widespread discontent, which populist leaders like Huey Long exploited. Long's Share Our Wealth program proposed redistributing wealth through higher taxes on the rich, appealing to people who felt neglected by the government. His popularity underscored the extent to which economic distress could fuel support for populist agendas. Modern-day implications of rising inequality. The US today bears some resemblance to these historical periods, with wealth concentration at an all-time high and a significant portion of the population struggling with financial instability. This inequality is further compounded by the lack of affordable healthcare, rising education costs, and insufficient social safety nets. According to a study by Pew Research Center, 61% of Americans believe that there is too much economic inequality in the US, and the vast majority of those surveyed felt that the government should do more to address this issue. The erosion of the middle class has amplified feelings of disenfranchisement, and this economic reality has driven support for both left and right-wing populist movements. For example, the 2016 presidential election saw the rise of populist candidates like Bernie Sanders on the left, who called for wealth redistribution and stronger social safety nets, and Donald Trump on the right, who appealed to working-class voters with promises to revitalize American manufacturing and prioritize American jobs. Both candidates tapped into the economic insecurities felt by millions, signaling a strong appetite for political alternatives to the status quo. Economic inequality as a threat to social stability. When wealth inequality reaches extreme levels, it threatens not only political stability, but also social harmony. Studies indicate that high levels of inequality correlate with increased rates of crime, mental health issues, and social fragmentation. In his research on the social impacts of inequality, Richard Wilkinson, a British social epidemiologist, found that countries with high inequality often have lower levels of trust among citizens and higher rates of violence. Wilkinson's findings suggest that as people perceive a lack of fairness and opportunity, they are more likely to feel alienated from society and act out in response to perceived injustices. The current economic climate in the US has contributed to rising housing costs and homelessness, further deepening social divisions. A report by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies found that nearly 38 million US households are considered cost-burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. This has exacerbated social tensions in urban areas where the wealthy and impoverished live in starkly contrasting conditions, often leading to resentment and frustration among residents who feel priced out of their own communities. The role of corporate influence in widening the wealth gap. The outsized influence of corporations and wealthy individuals in American politics has played a major role in maintaining and even widening the wealth gap. With Citizens United versus FEC, 2010, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations could spend unlimited amounts on political campaigns, effectively amplifying the power of the wealthy in shaping public policy. This ruling allowed corporate interests to influence legislation that favors the wealthy, such as tax cuts and deregulation, often at the expense of workers' rights and social programs. A study by Princeton University highlighted this phenomenon, concluding that policies benefiting the wealthy have a much higher chance of being enacted than those supported by the majority of citizens, further entrenching inequality. This corporate influence has led to tax policies that disproportionately benefit the wealthy. According to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP, recent tax reforms, including the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, have contributed to widening income inequality by offering significant tax cuts to corporations and high-income earners while providing only modest relief to low- and middle-income households. As wealth continues to accumulate among the top earners, the middle and working classes face a diminishing share of economic growth, fostering resentment and fueling populist sentiments. Social media amplifying populist sentiment. Social media has become a powerful tool for populist movements, allowing discontented citizens to organize, share grievances, and mobilize quickly. Platforms like X and Facebook enable populist leaders to directly communicate with followers, bypassing traditional media outlets and amplifying messages that resonate with economically marginalized groups. This direct communication has led to the formation of online communities that feel disconnected from mainstream political discourse and are more likely to support populist agendas. For example, the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, although short-lived, highlighted the growing frustration with economic inequality and the influence of Wall Street. The movement popularized the slogan, "We are the 99%, which underscored the wealth disparity between the richest 1% and the rest of society. While the movement eventually dissipated, it laid the groundwork for future populist discourse and continues to influence the rhetoric of economic inequality in political debates. Potential long-term implications of rising inequality. The long-term effects of rising inequality, if left unaddressed, could result in deeper economic and social instability. A study by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, warns that high inequality can reduce economic growth by limiting the spending power of a large portion of the population. In a consumer-driven economy like the US, where household spending constitutes approximately 70% of GDP, weakening the financial stability of the middle and working classes poses a significant risk to economic growth. The combination of economic insecurity, political disillusionment, and social fragmentation creates fertile ground for movements that challenge traditional political structures. This could lead to increasing polarization, as voters become divided along class lines, seeking either progressive or nationalist policies that promise to address their economic concerns. The Brookings Institution has also warned that rising inequality in the US could undermine the country's global standing, as social instability weakens its economic and political influence on the world stage. The urgent need for policy solutions. The widening gap between the wealthy and the poor in the United States presents a clear threat to social and political stability. Academic research, historical examples, and current data all suggest that unchecked economic inequality can lead to populist movements, political polarization, and social unrest. As more Americans feel disconnected from the benefits of economic growth, populist leaders who promise drastic changes will likely continue to gain support. Addressing this issue requires a comprehensive approach, including progressive taxation, investment in social programs, and policies that strengthen the labor market and ensure fair wages. Without meaningful action, the US risks further entrenching inequality, which could have profound implications for the nation's democracy and social fabric.